Welcome to Confronting the Line, where we explore the world of personal development and examine the sometimes blurry line between transformation and exploitation. I'm Mark Tafoya. We're coming back to our conversation with Ed Gurowitz, who was around EST, the Landmark Forum, in the early days. And we're going to resume our conversation with him right now and get into some more of the history.
In the 80s, he put together what he called the project to recreate the training.
Uh-huh.
This was in about 82, 83. And the joke was, because in the training, one of the principles was anything you recreate disappears.
Mm.
So we said, but Werner, then the training will disappear. Ha, ha, ha. Well, that's exactly what happened. He led a bunch of trainings that were specifically labs for him to work on redesigning it. And then those of us on the committee, the project, would get together and say, let's keep this, let's do this. And when we got all done, he'd tell us what he was going to do. And the outcome of that was the forum, which originally at that time in 1984, I believe, I'm lousy on dates, so if anybody's going to try to make me about dates, this is my disclaimer. I'm probably wrong. But around that time, mid-80s, the forum was 2 weekends. All of us who were trainers and trainer candidates, which I was by then, were now forum leader candidates, except Jerry Joyner, who became the first fully certified forum leader.
Okay.
Shortly after that, all of us became forum leaders as well, which I was. And then a couple of years later, we shortened it to 1 weekend, 3 days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and I led the first 3-day forum in Washington State, in Eastern Washington, in the Tri-Cities, which I don't remember even what they are, but
Chehalis, so I can't remember. I'm from there, but yeah, middle of Washington State.
Puyallup, something else. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, so that's how the forum came to be its current iteration. In the meantime, we stopped doing the 6-day. I've never been sure why. It was a huge. It was a great selling program, but for some reason, I think for liability reasons, it just somebody decided it was more than they wanted.
What I've noticed in the pattern is pretty much change happens, and I think this is consistent with any organization, but change happens when either the sales drop to a unsustainable level, and usually even quite far after that, however much the cash lasts, right? And then, or when they're forced via, litigation usually. So, or some kind of governmental or public, like a PR problem that's going to shut it down. I mean, that's where we lost Landmark, out of France, out of Sweden, many countries. It's disappeared because of that. Basically somebody comes on and starts telling all the stuff that's been hidden, basically is what happens, or the stuff that isn't examined. So, well, I'm curious how different was, because you were there in that transition from the S training to the 2-week forum. Then did you say all the way to the 1 weekend? How much of the S training, because we were always told it was very different, that they retired the S training completely and then invented the forum, which was all this totally new thing. And then they condensed it into a 3-day. How much of a through line is there between the fundamental, technology or work as it's referred to?
Well, the through line is transformation. The cosmetically, it was very different. So there wasn't the obsessive quality to the program. You could go to the bathroom. It only lasted until 11 or 12 each day.
Gotcha.
The emphasis on bringing guests didn't change at all.
Right.
Um, the, the shift in emphasis. So the purpose of the S training, if I can remember this right, is to transform your ability to experience living so that things that you've been putting up with or trying to change clear up just in the process of life itself. I can't believe I just remembered that whole thing.
Isn't that
was
shocking?
verbatim.
I know.
Wow.
Every once in a while, stuff will come out of my mouth, and I'm
Bravo.
like, "What? Bravo is right," because I've actually been reading a lot of newspaper articles. I mean, we have something like almost 100 newspaper articles gathered now from going all the way back to the 70s. And there's one that you said it almost exactly. And there's a version later, as a program leader that, in what you said, now I can't pull the trigger, but came up and said, that it transforms in the process of, it wasn't it transforms in the process of life itself, but it was close to that. So it definitely
clear up just in the process of life itself.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well,
Gotcha.
the forum, as I remember, I don't think I had never thought about this before, but the forum didn't have a formal statement of purpose like that.
Uh-huh.
But it was really about transforming to live a life of possibility.
Gotcha.
So the emphasis was not on what have you been putting up with and trying to change. It was on completing your past and creating a world of possibility. And possibility in the forum became the new buzzword.
It's funny, the
That word you
introductions.
didn't hear.
I trained, the first thing that you do when you train to be a leader in this kind of organization is you train to lead the introductory events, right? The homes, the coffee talks, the da-da-da. And then I trained those trainers. That was my first leadership position. And definitely in that format was something about, you would always ask the question, what are you resisting putting up with or trying to change in your life? And then you would get that all up on the board. And then you would, I don't remember which process you did, the don't know, or whatever, but you did some process. So the point was to have people have a breakthrough in the introduction with something they're, resisting putting up with or trying to change in their life. And they've been unable to change. So
Right.
all of that, I think all of it's stayed. And it was interesting when I was doing the Being a Leader project, I spent a lot of time in what was called the prep room, which is basically the room where the material is being, the colleagues are sitting in a U-shaped table looking at a big screen and they're developing the work, the distinctions, the program. And then there's a crew of us that kind of sit in an outer ring who get brought into the conversation from time to time. But it was really cool. I got to sit there and watch a lot of that process. But after about 9 years of it, I realized it was kind of all the same stuff said another way. And now that I'm learning the history and talking to people like you, I'm hearing like, oh no, it's really the same stuff said another way, going all the way back.
I wouldn't agree with that where the forum's concerned, because
Gotcha.
here's what happened. Werner in the early 80s became interested in several things. One was Fernando's work, which is in a lineage from John Austin, John Searle at Stanford, to Fernando. Okay, all about speech acts, the power of language, etc. That's one thread. Second thread is Heidegger that we mentioned. The study of being, ontology.
Okay.
And the third was Umberto Maturana, which you may or may not have heard of. He was another South American biologist whose work, his most famous paper was called What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain. And his work was about the difference between, I'm way oversimplifying, the difference between objective reality and how the world occurs.
That's the Being a Leader stuff. That's what we were at work on in Being a Leader. The fundamental.
Those three things were the big shift in approach from the training to the forum. The training
This
was
is mid-80s is when this happened? This shift started to happen in the mid-80s? Early 80s. Got it. Okay.
Early to mid.
Sure.
And that's a huge shift. The training, while they talked about being and told the famous ballerina story, was really took place primarily in the arena of doing.
All right. Gotcha.
Okay?
Yeah.
Giving up trying to change things, giving up putting up with things, but very little about, compared to the forum, very little about being. The forum was centered in being, no question about it.
Okay.
And so language, for example, Heidegger says is the house of being.
Mm-hmm.
Hence, and he's not wrong, because you can create an entire world through language.
Yeah. Or a perception of a world.
Right. And the well, yes, and that's the thing about occurring. It isn't, the world is whatever it is. We have no access to it.
Yeah.
Or not. We don't really know. The only access we have, and this is Maturana, is through our brain, through our perceptions.
Yeah.
So, or through how the world occurs. And so we began doing things in the forum like throwing tennis balls, if you're familiar with that.
Well, that all came back. I mean, big time. The Being a Leader project was really, and I would come to see it as we worked on it over 9 years, right? So it was how long I was a part of that. Werner was that if people just came out of that with one understanding, which is that the world is, everything in their world is about how it's occurring to them. How you show up for yourself, how you show up in the world, how you show. So it was, and if they could see that the occurring was happening out here, then you would have this, just huge power as a leader. And I don't think that's incorrect. There's a bunch of stuff missing that needs to get added in there, and how it shows up for us triggers the emotional state, because lots of studies have shown that our actions are literally directly correlated to how we're feeling, our emotional state. So we see something, we have an emotional or a physiological response, and then our body acts, right? So they kept kind of cutting that part out. They
also up to a point ignored that the perception of the world is shaped by conclusions we drew at around age 4.
Right. Now you're in my field. Now you're in the wisdom course. That was my whole, what I taught, for years and years and years and years.
So we would do things like, who here is really terrible at catching a ball? You couldn't catch a ball to save your life.
Yeah, I've seen this.
And somebody would say that. Okay, they were. So we'd bring them up front and we'd test it. We'd throw the ball and they would flail around. Then we'd say, okay, I don't want you to catch the ball anymore. Just watch the ball and tell me which way the seams are rotating.
Yeah. We did this in the forum, right, Mark? Forum or advanced course? I can't remember.
This was part of the forum. Exactly.
I think that was advanced course by the time it got down the line, if I remember correctly.
We did it in the forum as well. And they'd they'd tell me which way, very accurately, which way the seam, and the ball would go past them and they'd have to go get it. And after a couple of times, they got tired of going to get it and they'd catch it very naturally, very easily. And so, the decision they made when they were 4 years old, that they're lousy at catching a ball, was shaping how the ball occurred for them as a threat rather than as an opportunity. Yeah. So that's
incredibly powerful. To me, this is the purity of the tech, the purity of the work.
And if I can make a plug, if I can put in a plug, this is what my new book on transformation is about.
Yeah.
Now, there was a woman who was a trainer candidate at the time I came west in 81, a woman named Tracy Goss, who passed on just a few months ago. And Tracy took the work that she had learned as a trainer candidate. She was doing consulting and all that. And she came up with this idea called the winning strategy, which was basically what I just said. You came up, Eric Byrne, the founder of transactional analysis, said, every child by the age of 4 has to answer the question, what do I have to do to survive around here? And that becomes a strategy for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
Well, Tracy said the same thing. She called it the winning strategy, which then, I won't go into the the dark side of this, but in the end got incorporated into the forum.
Yeah.
And that
That's
there was nothing like that in training.
That's one of the
Interestingly enough, it wasn't Werner's.
Yeah, that's one of the other sort of big lies, if you will, is that the stuff that's in the forum, Werner thought it up. And this is another thing we see with these gurus and whatnot is they take ideas, they synthesize it. I mean, Werner definitely put together some ways of delivering. Some of them really worked. I mean, his way of delivering the whole occurring thing in the Being a Leader course was the biggest flop I've ever seen. I mean, I saw it like 19 times and I was like, this is really stupid. I mean, it didn't work. It was a whole thing with golf clubs and rocks. And you would not believe what I had to do in Abu Dhabi to go find a rock. So anyway... I mean, this is where we'll kind of put aside the tech work
no rocks,
for a future episode. Ed and I are going to definitely be having some more conversations about this. But I want to kind of come a little bit back to, and we'll start to wrap up and come to our audience questions, Mark. So just kind of a cue if our audience has any questions they'd like to ask, start putting those in the chat. But
we've already been gathering those.
Oh, good. Okay, good. Well, we should, I just want to see if there's anything in the story of your time and your lineage of coming up through and being a part of the development of the forum, at its gestation. I'm curious, what had you leave? Why did you leave when you left? Other than it sounds like you left about the same time Werner left.
Yeah, I did. And those are not unrelated.
Yeah.
I'll make a long story short because this could be a whole podcast.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll do it.
In the late 80s, early 90s, there were several times while I was there when the trainers and forum leaders were given double duty as a way of saving money. So one time I was the center manager in Berkeley, Oakland for a year.
Okay.
In one of those moves. That way they paid me as a trainer, which was pitiful. And they didn't have to pay a center manager, which was also pitiful, but this way it was only half of what was pitiful.
Right. And the schedule of those two things, I mean, is Herculean. Like it's
right.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't really the forum as often when we were center manager. We did it maybe once a month.
Yeah. Yeah.
But as I know, David will agree, the pressure of being a center manager was way worse than being a forum leader.
I think it's the toughest job. It's the toughest job in the organization. For sure in Lindemark, but probably Werner Erhard and Associates. Yeah.
Yeah. Just on the hook by Friday, 6 p.m. now 3 p.m. You've got to produce this result. Period. No question.
Oh, and it's way more than that in terms of you've got the budget, you've got the staff. You're their first go-to when they're in tears.
Yeah.
You've got all the assistants.
Yeah. You've got the well-being issues. That was a big thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Another time when that happened, one of those times when we were farmed out, I was farmed out to Technica.
Oh, yeah.
I had already worked with Werner on the transitioning transformational in my capacity as a director, transitioning transformational technologies, which was a franchise, over to Technico, which was a license, and we can get into the distinction there at a different time. But
yeah, just as a super brief explanation, Technico is currently still today the entity that licenses individual people to go do this work outside. So they're using the distinctions, they're using the technology, but they're kind of like licensed to do that. Yeah.
Well, see, and it's interesting because my job in Technico, this was 1990, when the shit hit the fan for Werner. He was being accused of incest with his daughter, or molesting his daughter. He was being accused of tax fraud, which was totally not true. I mean, I've seen the letter from the IRS totally exonerating him from that.
Well, I've seen the case. Remind me to show it to you. I don't know if it was totally not true, but he certainly didn't get caught. I mean, but
the IRS said there was.
Who isn't trying to cheat
no
the IRS?
Yeah, I've seen it. Anyhow, so Werner did three things, maybe four. He released, so this is a whole other story. Trainers, and by extension, forum leaders, gave our word for life.
Right.
Okay. Now, did people break their word? Yes. A number had, and they became pariahs. I had to uninvite a fellow forum leader and trainer, a guy I had worked closely with, and we were close friends. I had to uninvite him from my wedding.
Oh,
because he had left.
Oh.
And, the threat was, if you don't uninvite him, none of the other trainers, forum leaders, will come.
Yeah.
Yeah. So real excommunication type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's not something I'm proud of, by the way. I apologized and completed with him, as his wife still hates my guts. But anyhow, so he released us from our word.
Okay.
Number two, he left the organization and ostensibly turned it over to the employees.
Yes, his brother and sister. Yes.
Number three, Technico sold off all the licenses. There were about 60 license holders. For a fee, you got your license in perpetuity, never had to pay royalties, never had to do anything except keep the terms of the license.
Yeah.
I had gone to Technico. I was working in Boston because when the shit first hit the fan, Werner got out of Technico ostensibly, brought in a new CEO, part-time, an adjunct professor at Harvard Business School, and a new head of programs from another business school, I can't remember now, down south. And I went to keep Technico pure, to make sure that they didn't mess up the technology. I was basically to be Werner there. That was my job.
Okay.
And when Werner pulled out of everything, so ostensibly, we sold off, and I was the one who sold off the license. Technico was going out of existence.
All right.
In March of 91, I left Technico. We closed it. I was given a technical license and also the rights to a program called Center for Management Design. That's a whole other story. Anyhow, Technico didn't go out of existence. Werner wasn't out of it. More licenses were issued after that, but the people who had licenses did have them in perpetuity. They paid for it, thousands of dollars, and had the license in perpetuity.
This is another pattern that happens a lot. It would take probably months and some more investigation, but it's one of the things where something goes out, but then it doesn't quite. It goes out for these people. Exactly. It gets resold to these people over here. It's part and parcel with, we're reinventing the organization, except what you get when you're done reinventing it is exactly what you had before with lipstick on it. And probably a few more splits, because with every split, in other words, I sell it to these people, and then I change a few words and I sell it to these people and these people and these people. Right. There's more revenue for Werner, fundamentally. I mean, I watched it happen. I was part of that in my little era, right? So really interesting.
So anyhow, to finish your question so we can get to the audience questions, I was then supposed to come back to working for, can't remember what it was then, WE&A or Landmark or whatever the hell it was.
It was transnational something for a year, and then it was Landmark.
I was supposed to come back to being a forum leader. Well, one of the things when I went to Technico was I got paid a much larger pittance. And I was supposed to come back and take a pay cut. And I said no. In fact, I can't remember how many it was now, but somewhere between 15 and 25 of us left in spring of 91. There was what we called a forward, because forum leaders don't retreat, we
Yeah,
forward.
go forward. Yeah. Still
so
have
there was
that.
a
We still do
retreat
that today. Still today.
at the Hyatt in San Francisco, at the Hyatt Regency. I remember this.
Mm-hmm.
And we were told, basically, things are going to, you're all coming back. You're all going to be leading the training. You're all going to be, just like before. And somewhere between 15 and 25 of us said no. We left right from that meeting.
Wow.
And that was when I left, because I now had a consulting practice. I had a license. I had, more importantly, because of a very, very stupid contract on their part, I had rights to the Center for Management Design, which was then called the Executive Excellence Program, which was the entire technology.
Wow. Yeah.
And
So-
were you one of the people who had that in perpetuity?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I
Not great
went into business.
on their part, like you said.
You went
Yeah,
off and
no,
made some money and made a difference. Turns out I've heard rumor, Ed, that
exactly.
you can do both. I haven't witnessed it yet, but I've heard
Yeah.
I'm
rumor.
living proof that you can do very well by doing good. That's what they said about
Yeah.
the missionaries in Hawaii.
Beautiful.
They came to do good, and they did damn well.
Mm.
Well, you can make money, and I know a lot of people who are doing it, making a difference.
And Ed, in that
There's no-
91, that shift when you left, was any of it, did any of those 15 of you who left have anything to do with the scuttlebutt around Werner, or was it just an opportunity since there was a shift? Okay, I can get out of here. Like, what was the real reasoning for you behind that and the other people who left?
It had nothing to do with it for me.
Yeah.
I can't speak for any of the other people. I
Yeah.
do know that after they left, a number of other people, forum leaders among them, were sued by Landmark and settled the lawsuit for $10,000. And that figure kept coming up. $10,000 was apparently the price of getting Landmark to leave you alone. That for me, that was the point at which I realized that, if I hadn't realized it before, that there was a level of bullying going on that was beyond anything I imagined in the past.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew there was bullying going on. I knew there was physical abuse, to Ann's point, and everything else. But that, I mean, when forum leaders, one person who was instrumental in single-handedly bringing the forum to another country,
Yeah.
they sued him. He has to pay him $10,000. A number of people came to me and said, "Can you help me?" And I did what I could with them, and some of them got out of it without paying the $10,000, because guess what? If you stand up to a bully, they back down.
Exactly. And that unfortunately, I mean, it would seem, and I think since the pandemic, Landmark's got a whole other set of problems, so they're not as rigorous in
Litigious.
that. Yeah, they're not
Yeah.
quite as legit. Well, they don't have any money. I mean, they're very quickly sort of going out of
Yeah,
existence.
they've
So
got lawyers on retainer. It costs them nothing to sue
Yeah.
people.
yeah. Well, one of those lawyers happens to be probably, I don't know if he'd still consider himself a friend, but I consider him a friend, and good man, good people. But the whole idea comes down to it's Werner's work, it's Werner's ideas, which just isn't true. Now there are copyright and intellectual property laws and all that kind of stuff. That's fine, but he doesn't. Mike Jensen used to say this thing: you can own words on a page, you cannot own ideas. And they are constantly
Right.
trying to enforce that they own the ideas. So Brian North.
There exists a document that
Yeah.
lists every distinction in the forum
Yeah.
and where it comes from.
It's
And
lineage.
none of them come from Werner. I spent
Wow.
a weekend with Alexander Everett, who was the founder of Mind Dynamics.
Yeah.
Werner was a Mind Dynamics trainer.
Yeah.
Charlene Aframo, who's a forum leader and one of
Was
the
his
original trainers,
Yeah.
was his trainer in Mind Dynamics, trained him in Mind Dynamics, trained
Yeah.
Werner. And Everett said the same thing. And Everett was a very interesting guy in his own right. but it all came from Mind Dynamics. And Mind Dynamics, Everett said, came from what Aldous Huxley calls the perennial philosophy.
This is what, Brian Nord, because lots and lots of people are calling us, now those of us that are speaking out publicly, we're getting lots of calls from great people like Ed, right, who are telling us a lot of really amazing stories. But one of the things that's consistent, even to this day, and it was certainly my experience, when you read my book, Chapter 8, Betrayed, is all about how I got ejected from, my usefulness was over and I got threatened. And that pattern is again and again and again, which is part of what makes it so ludicrous when they're now trying to say, Anne didn't come to us. I'm like, what are you talking about? The last time you talked to me was to threaten me legally and demand that I basically claim no past with the Being a Leader course or landmark, like to erase my past. And, I was ejected from the spaceship. Honest to God, I'd like to say that if I hadn't been, I would have woken up to what I have now. But the truth is I probably wouldn't. I'd probably still be shilling for landmark in some way, shape, or form. You think I would have? Okay, good.
Would have, because you're not cult material.
Well, I sure participated for a long time for a non-culty material.
Yeah, so did I. So did a lot of people that I've known.
So did we all.
Saw through it in the end. And there are plenty of people who didn't see through. Let me say this, Anne, and I really think
you guys and then let's take some questions, Mark.
We did promise to take audience questions.
Yeah.
I'm not sorry I did it.
Yeah, I'm not either.
I met my wife. I wouldn't have my wife of 40 years. Okay?
So great.
I got my career. Look, ontological, transformational coaching and consulting is my work.
Yeah.
That's what I do. Yeah. I don't know that maybe I would, but I don't know that I would. I think I'm too intellectually lazy to have come to it on my own. Is it a cult to plug your book? Being a trainer, forum leader was.
Yeah.
Being on staff probably was.
Yeah.
And to some extent, high-level assisting, like seminar leaders and all that.
Yeah.
Could fit the bill.
Yeah.
Everybody who trained it, who participated in it, part of a cult? No. Not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if somebody asks, people ask me all the time,
go ahead.
Do I recommend it? I say, yeah, just do the forum and don't do anything else.
Yep. Yeah. Just dip in and get out.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's a perfect time for us to bring some questions in. So Ed, one of the questions from the audience is, did Werner's personality change as he became more famous? Was personal fame something he enjoyed?
I can't really tell because I didn't know him when he wasn't famous. But what I've read, including the authorized biography, as well as all the outrageous betrayal and other books that are unauthorized biographies, I'd say no. I think he mellowed some from what I read in Anne's book of how he was with her.
Yeah.
Certainly not how he was with me in a very similar job. And maybe it's because you're a woman, Anne, but I think it's actually because, look, I'm 81 years old. Werner's 93.
I think he also knew in the very first program, I share a light version in the book, but in the very first program I hosted, when one of his staff basically made our hotel contact cry and was really abusive to her. And then the general manager calls me in and is yelling at me. And I'm totally shocked because I have no concept that Werner, the father of transformation, could be abusive like that. It was shocking. And it wasn't about him, it was about his staff. But anyway, my response to that, though, I went back to that staff member and I said, knock it off. You're no longer allowed to talk with the hotel. Everything has to come through me and my husband. And if you do it again, if it happens again, because they had threatened the hotel, the general manager with, if they don't get whatever, it's something ridiculous, tissue boxes or some shit, that we're going to leave. We're going to take the whole group and leave. Well, I quickly informed them that that's not true, that I am the contract holder, that in the case of this, I am the host. This is my relationship, and you're not going to fuck with my relationship with the hotel. And if you do stuff like that again, I will ask you to leave. And that was our first event. So I think Werner knew basically he couldn't screw with me because I wasn't really, first of all, I wasn't a Werner Sinka fan. I mean, it was interesting. I enjoyed getting to know him. I learned a lot in being around him. Like that's all of that. But he never occurred for me as anything other than sort of a man. And
Right.
what's interesting to that question, Mark, I will say, because I was part of bringing him back into the North American audience and who he was in 2012, which was the first program I hosted. I met him in 2010 at another program that I did, was in the back of the room for a 2011 program at a university. And then I hosted in 2012. As Werner got back in front of his audience, back in front of his adoring fans, he did change. I don't think his fundamental personality, the abusive stuff, I think that's baked in from childhood, that kind of stuff. Ed, you're a psychologist, you could say more about that. But in terms of how he related to himself and to the audience, I did watch that change because we were only ever going to do one program. And then it was so successful. He's like, I'll commit myself to one a year. And the other colleagues did as well. And as we started to bring more and more, and then the Technico affiliates, they all start coming and they start bringing their clients and they start, all the way up to, we did later have somebody ask the big question, are you Jesus Christ or are you like that? And he had a very different answer than the one he had from Outrageous Betrayal, which my dear friend jokes because by then he'd figured out they crucified Jesus. So he didn't really want that analogy. But he did change. I did see him change. And as I've been studying narcissistic personality disorders, I can see that probably the worst thing for somebody who's bent that way is to have that kind of adoration and fandom. It doesn't nurture the best in their personality, right? So we all have, positive traits and negative traits. So it was interesting to watch that change though, from 2012 to 2019, 2020, he pretty disassembled in a lot of ways. And, that's all I'm going to say about that. And we should take another question.
Sure. Any response to that, or no? You're good for the next question? Okay. So, and this is in the realm of psychology. So the question is, when working with Werner in the psychological domain, was it common for participants to have psych issues and or be removed from the course?
I don't quite know how to answer that. People got removed from the course for being disruptive. They rarely got removed from the course. I never saw anything I would call a breakdown, a psychotic break. I never heard of. That's not true. If someone was missed going in, if the screening missed it and they were psychotic or had mental issues before they did the program, that might show up during the program and they might get removed. It was very, very rare. Now, remember, I left in 91. That's, 30 plus years ago.
Yeah.
I understand that two things. One, the therapist on call, the screening and all that program was ended.
Let go. Yeah, it ended for what?
Let go. Somebody said it was because of Americans with Disability Act. I doubt that. But for whatever reason, it was let go. And two, I have heard that there have been more frequent incidents, including one person who contacted me after I was on with Ann on another webinar and was clearly troubled. But I suspect she might have been before. I don't know. As a psychologist, I don't feel I ethically have the license to diagnose people I haven't seen. So other people can call Werner a narcissist. I don't do that, regardless of what I might think.
Yeah. Okay. So this is actually another question, but it's sort of related to the and you sort of answered part of this already, but the question is, there are multiple mentions of news articles talking about psychosis in the EST trainings. If it didn't happen a lot, why did you make sure there was so much psychological help available? And can you speculate on why did they get rid of all of that?
Why we made sure there was so much help available was the reason there were so few incidents, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, relatively speaking, given the nature of the work, I've read a lot of those newsletter articles. It definitely happened, but anyway, I think that you were quite successful.
Yeah, when I was there, it was a very rare, and I wouldn't even, I mean, people throw psychological terms around. I wouldn't call it psychosis. Psychosis is a chronic condition.
Uh-huh.
People, we called it an incident, and that's probably the best thing to call it. Why did they get rid of it? I don't know. I think it was a, if they did get rid of it, I think it was a mistake.
Yeah, happened after you left,
I work with another organization called Mankind Project. We do weekends all over the world for men, 48 hours transformational experience for men, and we screen people very medically and psychologically very carefully, because if you're going to put people through an intense experience, the one thing you don't ever want to do, and you can't totally avoid it, is re-traumatize people. People are traumatized.
Yeah.
People hold trauma in their bodies, and you don't want to re-traumatize people. So, we're essentially screening for how likely is it this person's going to be re-traumatized.
Right. There's no guarantee, but you're doing your best to try to say, hey, we don't want to put you purposely in that kind of condition. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is no guarantee in surgery either. I mean, you do your best to maximize the best outcome.
Yeah. So we had two questions that I'm going to kind of combine into one regarding specifically Scientology. So the one question is, what did he know about EST and its connection to Scientology? L. Ron Hubbard hated Werner, considered EST a squirrel group, and developed an EST recovery rundown. And then there was another question that was earlier that said, was there a Scientology e-meter around at the center? And to your knowledge, did Werner use it?
I am told I have not done Scientology. I've only studied it, read about it, etc. I have no firsthand experience. However, I believe, look, I'll give you an analogy. For a long time, I consulted with the Dale Carnegie organization, particularly in Europe. Not training, their training is wonderful. I consulted with them on the business side, the organizational side. And every once in a while, I would say something or do something, and they would look at me funny, and I would say, we stole that from you, right? Yep.
Yeah.
I have no doubt there are parts of the training, the forum, other programs, particularly in the wisdom area, that have elements of Scientology.
We have another guest I'm not at liberty to disclose at this time, but that will come in a few months or so, maybe less, we'll see, but who was there at the formulation of EST. And as well as I've been having extensive conversations now that I'm past my own freak out about the Scientology link, because I did have a freak out because I was sort of always very proud not to be in any kind of Scientology sort of program. And then I would hear that from the Scientologists, they say that, EST, Werner Erhard Associates, Landmark, blah, 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 is Scientology light. That's what they would call it.
I've heard that.
Yeah. And what I'm finding out from people who were there and many Scientologists is that's pretty likely true. That it was very, particularly EST, I think, but it's Scientology type ideas are very woven in. And I think Werner did what a lot of people do, which is he takes a lot of ideas, synthesizes them, pulls bits and pieces and parts, and, repackages it. I mean, that is what you do in this field to an extent. I'm now, as I'm standing for the safe and ethical practice and evolution of the field, what I say is give credit. Just say, hey, I pulled from this and I pulled from that and I pulled these
Exactly.
things. This is the lineage. And then here's how I packaged it together. And maybe this will be valuable for you in a different way. It's not a
That's what we
problem.
as chefs do, by the way. As
I
chefs,
agree
we
with
take
that.
all the ingredients and put them together and give you a dish. It's my dish, but these are all the ingredients I got.
Right.
Exactly. And that's why in my book, for example, I'm very careful to cite sources for everything. It reads somebody said like an academic paper, because there's a footnote every few lines. With regard to the e-meter, I'm not sure what an e-meter is, but I will tell you there was a thing that we called the tin can, and I'm pretty sure it was an e-meter.
Yeah, it's two tin cans that you hold in.
In Ann's part of the organization, before that part of the organization went public, when it was an internal facility called consulting services. And at least if you were on staff or you're a forum leader and your results were off or anything, you had to go get on the tin can. And the game among the forum leaders, because it's the easiest thing in the world to beat, was could we beat the tin can? And we all could.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah. So there was a question regarding Technico and this idea that you were encouraged not to share your affiliation with Technico. Can you comment on that?
It's a bit of an overstatement. Transformational Technologies was a franchise. That meant that everybody's business card, the logo, stationery, it was all Transformational Technologies, and under that was, Joe Blow Consultants. That led to some real difficulties. Mm-hmm. There was an incident in Atlanta where there was a farmer's market and a TTI consultant recommended that the owner have everybody do the training. The employees were mostly Christians and Koreans, and they objected on religious grounds, and there was a big stink. That's one example. So it was decided to change over to a licensing model. Now, in a licensing, so McDonald's is a franchise. Every McDonald's has Golden Arches, Happy Meals, etc. On the other hand, hotel chains are licenses.
We were in the hotel business. I don't know if you know this about me, Ed, but was my husband's business. There's a mix, but they're largely. Yeah. It's interesting because you still like Choice Hotels. He developed and built Choice Hotels for all kinds of doctor groups, and it has the same thing that you have to have these pictures. You can only have that color scheme. It's quite tied down until you get to a certain level, which is really quite low, the independence. Then you can have some autonomy.
But the point is, with a license, you're free to disclose or not. You're licensed for the IP, for the intellectual property, and then you can package that any way you want in a license. Whereas in a franchise, you must package it a certain way. So I think it's an overstatement to say people were encouraged not to disclose, but we were under no obligation to disclose.
Okay. All right. Understood. So here's a question from the audience. What does Ed know about LGATs, so large group awareness trainings, and state changes, psychological disruptions, lack of sleep, and the vulnerability of people sharing their deep, dark stuff in public? Maybe people didn't share as deep stuff in the 80s. I mean, that's possible. It would be great to know what was in those screenings. That's a long question, but yeah, the question is about LGATs.
That has to be somebody who's in our study group, Ed, because we've been reading a lot of Dr. John Hunter's recent work on LGATs and so on, which reminds me, I've got to make that introduce you and Dr. John Hunter. And
it's fun. There was much less known in the 70s and 80s. There was, I can't think who it was now, I'm blocking on the name, very well-known psychologist did a pretty extensive study. And we knew about that. And we knew that there was the potential for harm. The screenings basically were based on a couple of questions. Have you ever been hospitalized? Are you in therapy? There may have been a couple others. And then the therapist on call would interview the person, and it was basically using our own diagnostic and intuitive sense to determine it. We knew the potential for harm was there. We didn't know it to the extent somebody like Hunter has documented it broadly, and other people have now. But that's because of the stuff that happened then.
Also, Ed, wouldn't you say, we won't go too deep in this because we're going to wrap up here in a minute, but as I continue to study this and as I talk with people like Ed and, who were there in those times, life has changed a lot. Like we have the amount of noise and just noise and information and data that is flooding our brains, because this is part of John Hunter's work is and all the new thing, ADHD and all this stuff is a lot about the brain being flooded to the point where it sort of shuts down and disconnects, disassociates. And so there's a whole bunch, and maybe we'll do a whole other show about this, Ed, and bring on somebody who's done some of the recent neuroscience. It would be interesting because I don't think that we can separate at any time content from context. So the context of the 1970s and 80s and human beings and our lifestyle and what was happening in our lives and even our diet. I'm a big diet person, in that food is medicine. And, all of this has changed. So in 50 years, a lot has happened in the field, the contextual field.
Yeah.
And so the same content in a different contextual field is going to have different results and vice versa.
Well, and also, let me give you an example. I did a postdoc in 1967-68 at the University of Illinois Medical School in Chicago. And I worked with a guy named Art Kling, who was a neuroscientist. I think he was a psychiatrist. And we worked on what happens. There's this little structure in the brain called the amygdala.
Yeah.
What happens if you take that out? And we worked with a very aggressive species of monkey called African green monkeys.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found was they lost all their aggression. And we published a few papers on it and said, gee, isn't that interesting? Well, today, thanks to Danny Goleman and other people, everybody knows about the amygdala. Everybody knows about fight, flight, freeze, and appease. Everybody knows about, all the stuff Ann just mentioned. So, we didn't know this stuff then.
Yeah.
So I think there are two things, maybe three, that have changed the world as we know it. One is the internet.
Yeah.
Two is neuroscience. And three is COVID.
Yes.
Wow. That says it right there.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the world today, post-COVID, and in the presence of I remember the internet when it was work to get on.
Yeah.
When it was called the World Wide Web.
Yeah.
Right.
Took me 3 minutes just to
dial
in.
So people don't appreciate often, if you don't stop and think about it, how much the context has changed.
That's right.
Read my book.
That's right. And
Yeah.
we're going to make sure everybody knows about your book, Ed. And, fundamentally to me, this is part of why, Landmark's failing. I mean, the pandemic has killed pretty much every seminar company. So that's not on them. But one of the things that we all know in companies, if you do not stay current, you die. And, it's just a fundamental thing in business. And I think that's a big place. My book and asking the question, wait, is this a cult? Was because I couldn't figure out why they wouldn't get current. Like, why won't they? And what I would discover as I worked closely with Werner is because there's an attachment to Werner as the source. And Werner, in all of his glory and all of his flaws and all that aside, he's not of this time. He's not current. And he's not engaged, as much as he engages, he does read and whatnot, but Anyway, we won't go down my analysis there, but the point is, if a business doesn't stay current, they die. So, Mark, did you have one last question, or do we want to wrap it here?
One last question, and Ed, you tell me if this is something that we might want to say, if you can answer it succinctly, or if we might want to save it for the next time. So the question is this: interested in the word technology for language and distinctions. Where did the use of this word come from? I never saw it used in the field of psychology.
No, it's not used in the field of psychology. One of the struggles in Landmark and its predecessors almost from the beginning was, how do we talk about this stuff? It was referred to as a body of distinctions. Nobody knows what the hell that means. Methodology. Well, that takes it out of being and into doing. Technology, I think, was a term that was used first for transformational technologies, and I think because it was sexy. And we were trying to appeal to
Scientology term, just for the record.
Is it?
Yeah, that is. I asked Chris Shelton about that. Anyway, we'll have Chris on and have him give the Scientology story behind the tech.
Right.
Now, whether we used it or they used it because it was Scientology, I mean, look, I'm so tired of people trying to pretend that they own the damn English language. Nobody owns the English language, and the English language gets used by a lot of people for a lot of things. It's very diverse. It's very spread out. So,
and
anyway, we're talking as if there was only one English language.
Right, exactly. What was it, Mark? Yesterday, you were trying to do. Yeah. Mark was trying to do some setting for scheduling a thing, and he had to go through, 5 minutes in just trying to find a time zone and the language and the amount of English. And, oh my gosh, it's so funny. Trying to do a drop down.
Winston Churchill said that Americans and Brits are one people divided by a common language.
Absolutely,
beautiful.
So, right, so Ed, thank you for being here. The chat is full of thank yous, and it's so fascinating. And he's got to come back. We got to have him again, which we already planned for.
I hope you'll have me back. I've enjoyed it. I really appreciate your having me. And my book will be out by the end of the year. Hopefully, that's what my associate who's working on it with me promises. And in the meantime, if you haven't read Ann's book, read it. If you have read it, read it again.
Thank you, Ed. Such a pleasure to have you. I've enjoyed our conversations, both the private ones and this one, so much, and I look forward to continue to learn from you, and as I help to move us into the future. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so you stick with us here, folks. We're just getting going, and as you can see, we're working out kind of all of our kinks. But man, we have so much in line, so much in store for you. Please subscribe in YouTube. We're going to also have the availability to subscribe in audio podcast form. Listen for that. And like we said, if you haven't read Ann's book, you can find it at isthisaccultbook.com. And thank you for being with us. Catch you next time.
Thanks.